Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian Sukup, Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for the American Society of Interior Designers. Welcome to the first of 6 installments in a series of jointly hosted ASID and IIDA advocacy trainings. ASID and IIDA believe that all members of the profession, ASID, IIDA, and unaffiliated, must work together to present a strong, unified front to advance and defend the profession in the legislative and regulatory arena.
Hi everyone, this is Emily Kelly. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Legislative Affairs for the International Interior Design Association. I'm also joined by my IIDA colleague, Abigail Raspun. Together, Abigail, Brian, and I represent the government relations staff for the interior design profession. And over the next 12 months, IIDA and ASID will be jointly hosting 6 advocacy training webinars, which we hope will best prepare all interior designers and interior design allies to advocate for the profession. Leading this series of trainings are Andrew Goldberg and Christina Mason from Agora. Andrew and Christina are seasoned government affairs professionals with years of experience leading government affairs initiatives in the design and built environment industries. Finally, I just want to remind everyone that all participants in this live webinar will be eligible for 0.1 credit of continuing education from IDCEC. This course is not eligible for health, safety, welfare credit. So without further delay, IIDA and ASID would like to welcome Andrew and Christina.
Well, thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Brian, so much. We are really delighted to be part of this webinar series. We're calling this first webinar Advocacy 101 because the knowledge that we will be sharing today is going to provide a 30,000-foot view of how government relations work. The information we'll provide today will underpin everything that you will learn in future webinars in this series. So today we're going to provide an overview of what government advocacy is and how you can advocate to your elected representatives. But most of all, this webinar will cover the why advocacy matters, why interior designers need to advocate, and why it's important to be engaged in the civic process, even at a time when the political climate seems so unstable. And because there are so many misconceptions about politics and lobbying, we're going to share a number of myths that we've all heard over the years about advocacy and give you a new perspective on this very, very important activity. Now, to begin with, what do we mean by advocacy? There are plenty of definitions of advocacy, but the easiest way to think of it is that it's the art of effecting change through persuasion. Advocacy is about bringing people together to work towards a common goal that you want to see achieved. And advocacy can take many, many forms. Advocating for a client in a court of law, advocating for change in your community, advocating for children and people with disabilities, and so on. Typically, in the association world, advocacy takes 2 forms, public advocacy and government advocacy. Public advocacy is about educating various audiences to help change their opinions about something, to provide new perspectives, and to build awareness and sympathy. It's what we think of when we talk about public relations and media relations. In the context of interior design, public advocacy involves educating the public about what interior designers do, why their work matters, and how they can help make a positive difference. Now, government advocacy is different. It's about effecting policy change at all levels of government. Now, like public advocacy, there is a major communications and education component to government advocacy, helping policymakers know who interior designers are, why their work is important. All that is a very key component for getting them to vote in support of positions that interior designers support. But increased awareness is not the ultimate goal of government advocacy. Ultimately, it's about making changes in laws and regulations that impact the profession. Now, one question that we often get is, what's the difference between government relations and lobbying? Now, for all intents and purposes, they really are the same thing. Lobbyists are typically people who do this full-time professionally, and they often and usually have to register as lobbyists at the federal level or the state level, whereas advocates are typically people who are doing this in a volunteer capacity. Lobbying has a somewhat negative connotation, And so people sometimes shy away from using that term. But in the end, what we're talking about is the same thing. It's about persuading policymakers to agree with our position and take action. Now that brings us to our first myth that we often hear, which is that lobbying is what happens in smoke-filled rooms. People ask, well, why should citizens engage in advocacy? Isn't that why organizations like IIDA and ASID hire lobbyists? Let's talk a little bit about why it's important that everybody engages in government advocacy. The reality is that lobbying is something that everyone can do. In fact, it's something that everybody really should do. In fact, it's in the Bill of Rights, right there in the First Amendment, along with the freedom of speech and religion and assembly. The First Amendment says that Congress can make no law that prohibits the right of people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Government advocacy isn't just a right that we have, it's responsibility. It's as important as voting on election day. Being engaged with government is what keeps our democracy working. Now, some people also say that government actions have very little to do with our day-to-day lives. And it's true that what happens in Washington, D.C. at times can seem very far removed from our daily activities, our jobs, our communities. And even at times, the debates happening in the state capitol, and sometimes even at the local level, can seem distant and unrelated to what we do. But the reality is that government policy affects all of us. Just think about how many different ways that government at all levels impacts the work that you do. Pretty much everything that touches your bottom line is impacted by government laws and regulations. At the state level, legislatures are making decisions that impact your business directly. Whether or not interior designers can stamp and seal documents is decided by state governments. Whether clients will have to pay sales taxes on the services you provide, something that has been proposed in many states, affects your bottom line. Building codes, which impact interior design, are often ratified at the state level. Questions of business ownership, procurement of design services, all these are being decided at the state level by your state government. And it's not just at the state level. At the local level, decisions on whether to spend money on rebuilding or renovating schools and libraries are happening in city halls and at the county level. Zoning laws, which impact whether and how your clients can build or renovate, happen at the local level. And even at the federal level, even though it may feel distant, policies impact you. Federal tax policy is decided by Congress. Last year, about a year ago, Congress passed a major tax reform bill that has major impacts on the tax rates that you and your clients pay. Tax incentives and programs for historic preservation projects, for energy efficiency, happen at the federal level. Policies related to federal student loan rates and availability and repayment are happening at the federal level. National model building codes and standards. All these things are impacted by what happens in Washington. Each of these issues, and many more, touch upon your ability to practice. And here's the thing, lawmakers are going to make decisions on these policies whether you're in the room or not. And the people who may not agree with you and may have a different point of view are going to be there. So that's why it's important for interior designers to be in these discussions every single day. Now here's another myth, is that government advocacy is why we have lobbyists who carry all of the power and influence. Why do citizens need to advocate if you hire lobbyists to do that work for you? And the reality is that the most effective lobbyists by far are citizens, are everyday people who are doing that work at a grassroots level. Now before we go on, let me talk a little bit about what we mean when we say grassroots. Grassroots is a term that we use to refer to engagement by everyday citizens in making positive change for their communities and for the country. It refers to efforts by people who are volunteering their time and their energy to be involved in the issues they care about. You may also hear the phrase grass tops. This refers to people who have developed a closer relationship with policymakers, who know them very well and who have a little bit of more influence, but also are volunteers who are giving of their time and energy to make change. The key to both grassroots and grass tops, making them successful, is that the people who do these activities are doing it because they genuinely care about the issues on which they are advocating. For associations like IIDA and ASID, having strong grassroots and grass tops programs which are energized by the passion of their members is essential to be successful. And we'll talk about that a little more in a bit. Now, you may also hear about AstroTurf lobbying. And this generally refers to efforts that are funded by, say, bigger organizations or corporations or others that are made to look like genuine grassroots movements. Now here's another myth that relates to what grassroots is all about, and it's that politicians don't listen to their constituents. Why engage in grassroots advocacy since politicians are only listening to their donors or professional lobbyists or just doing what their party wants them to do? The reality is that constituents carry an enormous amount of sway with public figures. Studies have shown that direct constituent interactions have more influence on lawmakers' decisions than almost any other kind of advocacy strategy. In the case of the federal government, as you can see on the screen, there have been studies that show that members of Congress and their staff place a premium on hearing from groups and citizens who have built relationships with their elected officials. Grassroots advocacy works, and it does for a very simple reason. You are the boss. Elected officials are there to serve the constituents they represent. As a grassroots advocate, you are from the community, and you understand what's going on back home far better than the lobbyists do. You are more likely to have personal connections to the legislator, better connections than a lobbyist often will. And if nothing else, legislators know that come election day, their job security is in your hands. Most legislators, if they have a choice between meeting a professional lobbyist or a constituent, they will meet with a constituent from back in their district. It's that simple. Now, we'll talk in a subsequent webinar about how to build those relationships with your elected representatives. But let me say that's not nearly as hard as some people think. Your representatives, especially at the state level, are your neighbors. They are people in your community. Their kids play on your kids' Little League team. They go to the same church as you do. They're part of the community. And connecting with them at that community level helps create very strong relationships. And that creates results. And believe me, it does make a difference. Grassroots movements of ordinary people advocating for change has led to major advancements throughout our history. Everything from the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s to the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 to the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. All of these happened because of the passion, the energy of everyday people working to effect change. So we've talked a little bit about why it's important to advocate. But here's the question: what are we advocating for? Government advocacy involves asking policymakers to pass new laws or new regulations or provide funding to help solve a certain problem. Now, who's heard the statement, there ought to be a law? At some point, everybody says there's some problem in society, in the community, and we should just get government to take action to help change to help fix that problem. Finding problems or challenges we want to fix is fairly easy. And then it should be simple, right? Come up with an idea, get a group of grassroots advocates to push it, and just like that, you make change. In theory, it should be very simple, right? But the process that organizations like ASID and IIDA use to develop policy is more complicated because the process is a little bit more complicated. Now, if you are of a certain age, if you're from my generation, you might remember the Schoolhouse Rock, those little cartoons they had on Saturday morning about various educational topics. And there was one about how a bill becomes a law. It was called I Am a Bill, I Am Only a Bill. In the video, a bunch of constituents asked their congressman to introduce a bill that would require buses to stop at railroad crossings. He does, and the bill gets voted on by the committee and the House and the Senate, and voila, it becomes law. Now that process is basically accurate. It's what you were taught in civics class. But it is a little bit more complicated than that. And I want to talk about that process a little bit because it really underscores why an advocacy program is so important. The reality is that it takes much more than having a good idea or even the desire to make change to enact policy. Typically, a good policy has to meet several important criteria. First of all, is the problem clearly defined? Every time you advocate to the government, you are trying to address a problem, typically one that can't be solved any other way. If you can't clearly identify the problem, it will be hard to convince policymakers of the solution. Second, is it an appropriate role for government? Is it something the government is able to address? And more importantly, are you at the right level of government? The 10th Amendment to the Constitution reserves many powers for the states, not the federal government. Likewise, state governments delineate certain powers between the state and local governments. For example, it's up to the states to decide which professions have practice or title acts, not the federal government. Zoning laws happen at the local level. And it's important to understand where you are trying to effect change. Is it the right place? And by the way, in that Schoolhouse Rock video, laws about school buses stopping at railroad crossings are handled at the state level. So that bill probably would never be enacted in Washington, D.C. Not because Congress wants buses to get into accidents, but because the Constitution reserves that power to the states. And advocating to the wrong level of government can actually waste time and be ineffective. 3, will the solution that you're putting forward actually address the problem? And how will you be able to tell if it does? Finding a workable solution can be difficult at times. And that's where many of the debates happen. We know a problem exists, but coming up with a workable solution to make it happen through laws, through regulations, can be difficult. 4, is there a cost to it? Who's going to pay for it? Governments at all levels worry about how much they're spending, how much they're bringing in. At the state level, most, if not all states, have balanced budget requirements. Any proposal you put forward may have some cost to the government. If it's a new program or a grant program, for example, that will cost the government money. Other programs or policy ideas may have indirect costs on the economy. One of the first things that policymakers may ask you is, well, what does this bill cost? What's it going to cost the Treasury? And knowing what the cost is really important. 5th, is the solution realistic and achievable? There's nothing wrong with some blue sky thinking about legislation that will create an ideal state. But developing policy proposals requires that there be some level of reality to them. For example, if you are asking a government agency to undertake new responsibilities, are they equipped to handle that? Is that something that is in their capacity to do so? Last but not least, who or what else is impacted by your proposal? Are there other stakeholders, other professions, other groups who may oppose your idea because they feel it impacts them negatively? Will there be some unintended consequences down the line? Only when you answer all these questions can you begin to turn an idea into a policy proposal. And that's what groups like ASID and IIDA do every single day, identifying challenges, problems that the profession faces, and developing solutions that answer all these questions and meet these tests to make sure that they are policies that can move forward. Now, let's say you've created a good policy proposal, an idea for a new law, a government program, or so on. Does that mean it'll get passed? Well, look, if all it took to get something passed by government, by a legislator, was a good idea and a good argument, it would be easy. Look at the Schoolhouse Rock video again. The congressman introduced a bill. It gets passed into law in about 30 seconds. Now, we all know it takes a lot more than that. But why? Why is it that some policies, even good policies, don't get passed? Why do some groups take years and years and years to try to get a policy enacted? Is it because of gridlock? That because legislators just can't get anything done? Is it partisanship? Is it because better funded lobbyists from other groups get in the way? Well, sometimes, but not always. Here's the reality. There are many, many roadblocks to passing good policy. First and foremost, many bills that are introduced in state legislators or at the federal level or the local level never actually go anywhere. In Congress, there are about 3,000 bills introduced every single year. At the state level, across the country, there are about 190,000 bills introduced every single year. At the state level, of those 190,000, only about 16% are actually enacted and become law. At the federal level, it's even worse. Only about 2.8% of bills become law. Because even if you get a bill introduced, doesn't mean it's going to get voted on or become law. There are many other roadblocks that get in the way. Sometimes priorities change because of external events. In 2001, for example, I was working for another organization trying to get a voting reform bill passed. And then 9/11 happened, and everything that was not related to homeland security and terrorism dropped off the list. Look at what's happening in Virginia, or happened in Virginia over the past month or so, because of recent controversies related to the top 3 office holders. That's made it difficult for the legislator to focus on a lot of other issues. Another roadblock to getting policy passed is that sometimes the people change. Representatives leave office, as do staff. So if you have a congressman or a state assemblyman who's been your champion on a bill, if they leave office, you may have to find someone new to take on the reins. When I was at AIA, we had a bill on historic preservation that we championed for years. And over the time that we were pushing the bills, about 5 years or so, about 5 or 6 of our champions left Congress. One retired, one took a job in the administration, one was indicted, though thankfully not because of our issue. That meant every single time we had to find a new member of Congress to learn about the issue and become a champion for our bill. So people change, also parties change. If there's a change in partisan control, a bill that had the support of the party in power may lose support and momentum when the other party comes in. So there are a number of reasons that are outside your control that may cause a policy not to move forward. Having said that, the 2 biggest reasons that good policies don't advance are within your control. The first is because advocates don't build strong relationships with policymakers. If someone you barely know asks you to do something, you're a lot less likely to do it than if somebody you know very well asks you. Now, our next webinar will focus on the importance of building relationships, but it's important for advocates to be able to build strong connections to policymakers so they trust you when you come with an idea and ask for their support. Another reason why policy often doesn't move forward is because advocates don't develop a clear strategy on how to get it passed. And we'll talk about how to build a strategy around a bill in another webinar. But in short, you have to come up with a game plan. Who are you going to advocate to? What are the messages you're going to use? How are you going to counteract arguments from the opposition? One simple way to think about it is not coming up with a strategy to get a bill passed is kind of like starting work on an interior design project without developing a design first. You're going to waste a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of opportunities. What this means is that having a good advocacy plan, having relationships with policymakers, having a strategy for engaging with them and convincing them, advocating to them to support your idea are critical to getting legislation passed. Now, another myth we hear is that advocacy is always about making positive change. And usually it is, and of course that's what we all want to do. We want to be able to advocate to make things better and create a new policy that addresses a problem. And advocacy is often about creating good policy. But sometimes it's about stopping bad policy from taking place. There are 2 kinds of government advocacy. There's proactive and reactive. In proactive, you develop a policy idea and you work to build support and get it passed. Now, in reactive, someone else comes up with an idea and you have to react to it. Now, that policy idea may be a good one and you can support it. Sometimes it's a little good and a little bad, and so your goal is to make it better. And sometimes someone comes up with a proposal that, well, just stinks, and your job is to stop it. Now, stopping a bad bill might not be as satisfying as advancing a good one, but it is just as important. Because here's the thing. even when you get good legislation passed, even when you have a victory, that doesn't mean that your job is done. Your opponents may try to come back in the next session and undo what you did. A common mistake that many advocates do is they get a bill passed and then they move on to something else, thinking that their work is over. A lot of advocacy is about protecting your gains, because if you don't, you could very well lose them. Here's another myth we hear a lot. Well, the legislature is not working on anything we care about at the moment, so there's no need to advocate. Why waste energy talking to our representatives at this point? Well, the reality is that it's important to be engaged with legislators throughout the year. First of all, legislators do a lot more than just vote on legislation. They can hold hearings in their committees that help raise awareness about an issue or a problem. They can send letters or put pressure on executive branch agencies to take action when they're not doing that. They can help you raise public awareness by writing op-eds that talk about specific issues. They can help connect you to other influencers in your community or nationally who can help you fight for building support for your ideas. And they also can clue you into what's happening or what will happen down the line in the legislature. In fact, one of the most important aspects of meeting with legislators is gaining intelligence about the policy environment and what may be coming down the pike. And even if nothing is happening, it's important to meet with legislators throughout the year, because that's how you build relationships. You don't want to lose touch with a policymaker only to come rushing back in at the 11th hour when your bill is on the floor and then ask them to help you. Maintaining a relationship even during the slow times is going to help you when things heat up. Now here's a problem that we hear a lot, especially in this somewhat partisan, polarized time. Well, I don't agree with my representative on anything, and he or she is against me on these issues, so meeting with them is pointless. And so that's true. What if for whatever reason your representatives and you just don't see eye to eye on anything? Is it worth advocating to them? If the legislature in your state, let's say, is controlled by one party or the other that creates maybe a negative environment for the issue you're working on, how do you engage with them if they're not favorable to your views? And that may be a challenge, but it does not mean you stop advocating. There are many, many ways to overcome partisanship, whether it's by an individual legislator or by the entire body. First of all, thinking about the issues that you're targeting. We'll talk more about how you identify which representatives to focus your efforts on in a future webinar. But simply put, being strategic about who you engage with and on what can make a difference. For example, if your representative is more interested in helping small businesses, bring issues to them that help small business. If they're more focused on, let's say, the environment and sustainability, talk about those issues with them. Engage them on issues that they are passionate about, and you can find ways to kind of build connections. And think about the messaging as well. There may be many, many arguments in favor of your policy position. It may be good for business, it may be good for the public's health and safety, it may be good for the environment. But understanding which argument resonates best with a particular lawmaker can make all the difference. There's nothing wrong with highlighting different reasons to support legislation as long as the underlying policy you're advocating for is the same. Another reason you want to engage with your opponents is that even if you can't change your legislator's mind, you may be able to soften their opposition. Let's say your state delegate is an active champion for your opponent's position and is actively working against your interests. You may have a hard time getting them to completely reverse course and vote with you, but even if you get them to agree to not actively oppose your position, that's progress. Now, one other point also, don't assume you know where your representative stands on an issue. Just because they have disagreed with you on a whole bunch of other issues, don't assume that they are against you now. The best way to find out is ask them. You may also find out that their opposition to you, if they are, is based upon some faulty information or misconceptions. Use that as an opportunity to engage and educate them. And also remember, in the case of having a legislature, a body that is tilted away from your interests from a partisan standpoint, the partisan makeup could change. Congress has changed hands many times over the last 20 years. Since 2002, 28 states have seen at least one legislative change or switch parties. Now, that junior legislator in the minority party might become a member of leadership in the majority a few years from now. So even if the current situation is not ideal, keep at it because things do change. Another myth we hear is that lobbying is just about the legislature. And we talk a lot about how to lobby your state legislator or Congress and so on. But there are many, many great ways to influence government policy besides what's happening in the Capitol. There are many places to advocate. Executive branch agencies are writing the regulations that put legislation into action. They enforce the laws. They provide grants and funding for various programs, or use discretionary money to fund research projects and other endeavors. State and local boards and commissions have a great amount of influence over policies at the state and local level, everything from licensing boards to school and library boards, historic preservation boards, and so on. Getting in front of them is not difficult because while everybody else is lobbying the legislature, you may have more ability than to get in front of these groups and advocate for your position. Community groups and other professional trade associations that lobby are important also for building support. Advocating to other groups to support your positions can help build your power. We'll talk more about coalitions in a later webinar, but getting a broader alliance in support of your positions is going to help you be more effective. And last but not least, public advocacy is also very important. Educating the public about your profession and about your issues is a very effective way also then to help move your policy positions forward. Last but not least, so if grassroots advocacy is so important and so effective, why bother having associations in the first place? Why do you need to hire lobbyists if the grassroots can do that? Well, associations and their government relations teams play a very, very important central role in this process. They kind of act like air traffic controllers. At any given moment, there are hundreds of grassroots advocates who are willing to speak to their legislators. There are thousands of legislators at every level of government. There are tens of thousands of bills and amendments and regulations and proposals coming out every year. Making sure that all of these pieces work in harmony to make sure that your message is consistent, that your strategy for getting something passed is consistent, that the grassroots advocates are talking to the right person at the right time. All that requires having somebody in that control tower coordinating all the pieces. Lobbyists play a very important role in this process because they are spending their full time at the Capitol tracking the ins and outs of the process, which bills are moving, which members are working on what issues. They tend to know the details a lot better, and they also know when key issues are coming up. They also build relationships with policymakers, and they can help make it easier for constituents to meet with certain legislators. They also make sure that all the messaging is coordinated and accurate. You know, if 100 interior designers went up to the state capitol and urged their lawmakers to support, 50 different bills, or if they made widely divergent arguments for a position, that's not effective. The message becomes muddled and becomes very unclear. Lobbyists and associations help make sure that everything is coordinated so that the entire legislature is hearing a consistent, clear message about what interior designers want. Now, hiring a lobbyist is not like just turning on a light switch where you sign a contract with a lobbyist and all of a sudden the doors open and the legislature agrees with you. You need to lay the groundwork first by developing a policy agenda, as we talked about, building your case, and making sure you have the grassroots support behind your lobbyists to back them up. And even when you get a lobbyist, that does not mean that automatically everything will pass. As we said, the process takes time. Sometimes there are things out of your control that delay the process. But working together, lobbyists and grassroots advocates are a very powerful combination. Associations play another just as important role. They amplify your voice. When ASID and IIDA go to state capitals or to Capitol Hill in Washington, they are speaking on behalf of tens of thousands of members and thousands of businesses. And policymakers know that. And that's why advocating with your association is so effective, because you are bringing not just your voice, but the voice of so many of your colleagues and your fellow interior designers with you together. The thing is, associations ultimately are only as strong as their individual members. As we've said all along, constituents make the most effective lobbyists. Constituents working in unison under the banner of an association, like ASID or IIDA, are a very powerful advocate. So to sum up, if there are a few points that we want you to leave this webinar thinking about, it's these. Advocacy is everyone's right and responsibility to be engaged in the process. Policymakers do listen to their constituents, to the grassroots. It is a very effective way of getting things done. Third, getting good policy passed, which is the goal of advocacy, requires building strong relationships and developing a very clear strategy. For partisanship and gridlock does not have to be a roadblock. There are ways to get policy moving and build champions even in a challenging political environment. Fifth, there are many ways to engage with policymakers. It's not just about getting a bill passed. It's about raising awareness, about having them help connect you to other influencers in your community. And last but not least, associations help amplify your voice and help keep your strategy on track. As we move into the next webinars, we'll delve more into these topics, especially how you can be an effective advocate. But for now, let me say how pleased we are to be joining you today and talking about advocacy, and thank you to ASID and IIDA for including us. And with that, I will throw it back to Brian and Emily.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So since we're almost at the top of the hour, we're going to conclude today's session. We look forward to hosting Andrew, Christina, and all of you on our next joint profession-wide advocacy training webinar in late April. Again, that is late April. In between these 6 webinars, ASID and IIDA will jointly and separately be searching for additional policy and government affairs webinar content to inform all members of the profession. The first public policy webinar will be in March, on March 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where ASID will host International Code Council Senior Vice President Sarah Yerkes, who will discuss the ICC building code development process and the importance of modern building codes for design and construction.
We hope everyone enjoyed today's sessions, and be sure to tell your colleagues and chapter members about these webinars. All supporters of interior design are welcome on these. And always remember, for up to the minute advocacy updates, you guys can join our phone to action alert system by texting the term interior design to the number 52886. Again, if you want to text interior design to the number 52886, that will get you signed up for our phone to action alert system, which we use to just update folks on, what's happening in the interior design legislative world, and if anything's happening in your state that you should be aware of. It's helpful for you guys to be signed up for that so you can get up-to-date notifications. So thank you again, everyone. Hope everyone has a great rest of their week.